I want you to ask yourself something. What's wrong with Big Brother? Why is this mythical figure so bad? Why is the party so bad? And what is wrong with the oppressive regime in Orwell's 1984? Okay, as these questions might be embarrassingly easy for you to answer, let me ask you another one. Why do we sympathize with Winston Smith, the main character? Not why do you sympathize with the drive to break free from an oppressive society? Not why do you sympathize with his desire for freedom? Why do you sympathize with the character Winston Smith? And should you? 1984 tried to warn you. The dystopian world of 1984 explained. Is 1984 becoming a reality? The horrific future of 1984? This is what George Orwell got wrong. These are just a few examples of the literally hundreds of videos out there seeking to compare historical events of contemporary society to the plot, characters, themes and warnings of George Orwell in his famous work 1984. But after having myself read the book 4 or 5 times during my lifetime, having dived into countless analyses of the book and watched several videos with different interpretations of its themes and messages, I have noticed that there is one detail which most people seem to either miss or at least fail to mention for some reason. And apart from the many of Orwell's warnings gradually coming to life in contemporary society, such as increasing surveillance as part of the post 9/11 secularization process, the spreading of false information and the malleability of truth that has arrived with social media, and of course the excessive subjectivism and moral relativism which has come with postmodernism. This detail that I'm going to share with you in a moment seems to me one of the most relevant in the book, and it serves as a profound warning to anyone who seeks liberty that having a morally justifiable goal is not enough. How do we retain our sanity and sense of humanity in a world where the walls seem to be closing in on us? Where whoever is in power seems to be getting more powerful and whatever few rights we might have had, if any, seem to be disappearing before our eyes. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into Orwell's seminal work, and I'm going to share with you, based on my own analysis of this amazing piece of literature, the one detail from the story that everyone seems to be forgetting or at least underestimating. A detail so important and fundamental that I regard it as one of the prime warnings of Orwell, representing one essential component in creating or preserving liberty, fighting or preventing totalitarianism. But before we get to that one detail which no one seems to want to talk about, let's just go over the story real quick and make sure that we're on the same page with regards to the plot and the messages that everyone who has actually read this book should keep in the back of their mind at all times. Maybe you already know the story, maybe you don't, but here's a quick sum up. George Orwell's novel 1984, published in 1949, is a harrowing portrayal of a dystopian future where individual freedoms are suppressed under the weight of totalitarian rule. Set in the superstate of Oceania, the narrative unveils a society in which the state exercises absolute power over every aspect of its citizens' lives, both public and private. In that sense, Orwell's vision is a dark commentary on the potential dangers of absolute political power and the loss of personal freedoms. The story itself is set in Airstrip 1, formerly known as Great Britain, a province of Oceania. Oceania is at the same time perpetually at war with one of the other 2 superstates, either Eurasia or East Asia. The government, led by the party and its seemingly omnipotent figurehead Big Brother, maintains control through surveillance, propaganda and fear. Our protagonist, Winston Smith, is a party member who works at the Ministry of Truth. His job is to alter historical records, ensuring they always align with the party's current narrative and stance, erasing any inconsistencies or contradictions from the past. And this totalitarian state has the power to decide what is true or false, often altering the past to fit its current narrative. And this constant alteration of reality and disregard for truth from the part of the system underscores one of the novel's primary themes, the manipulation and control of information. Something which is obviously a relevant theme today as well, but that could be the subject of an entirely different video in itself. Now moving on with the story, as we follow Winston, he grows increasingly disillusioned with the party's oppressive rule. This discontent is manifested when he starts a diary, a forbidden act in which he records his subversive thoughts. As Winston's rebellion grows, he begins an illicit love affair with Julia, a fellow party member. Their relationship acts as both an act of defiance against the party's ban on genuine human connections, something that I've actually touched upon in another of my recent videos. So I suggest you go watch that if you're interested in why totalitarian systems have an interest in breaking up social and familial bonds. Now, as the plot unfolds, Winston and Julia are approached by O'Brien, a high-ranking party member whom they believe is a secret ally and part of an underground resistance movement called the Brotherhood. This hope, however, is short-lived. It turns out that their trust in O'Brien is totally misplaced, and this supposed rebellion is a trap set up by the party to catch dissenters. Revealed as traitors, Winston and Julia are arrested and taken to the Ministry of Love, where they face severe psychological and physical torture. O'Brien personally oversees Winston's re-education, confronting him with his worst fears and forcing him him to confront and accept the party's version of reality. An interesting point, and one that people often remember because it is quite a fascinating one, is that the torture's ultimate aim is not just to punish dissenters, but to alter their very way of thinking, ensuring total loyalty to Big Brother. In one of the novel's most chilling climaxes, Winston is taken to room 101, where he is confronted with his deepest fear, rats. In his desperation to avoid this terror, he betrays his love Julia, begging O'Brien to do it to her instead. And this act of betrayal of course signifies Winston's ultimate defeat. The novel ends with Winston being released back into society, his spirit totally broken and his rebellious thoughts quashed. He has been brainwashed into loving Big Brother, signaling the party's complete and total victory over the individual. Again, there are a number of videos out there comparing Orwell's warnings to different aspects of different modern societies in different places on the globe. And naturally, there are some pretty sharp comparisons out there, just like the malleability of truth, false information, etc., like we talked about before. One thing too significant not to mention is of course the 2 minutes hate concept introduced in the novel, where citizens are required to watch a film that depicts enemies of the state, most notably the party's arch enemy, and during which the emotions felt by the participants range from anger to fanaticism, and the intensity is such that some even feel a kind of ecstasy. After the hate is over, they're often left feeling more bonded with one another and more devoted to the party, having shared this collective emotional experience. You could obviously compare this to the general emotional drivers of any form of crowd behavior, and how the act of demonizing your enemy and sanctifying your allies is something which is used by our own institutions all the time. But this is still not the detail that I'm referring to. I want you to first consider this. Is it really that important whether the spirit of Winston Smith is broken in the end? This is of course what everyone who has read the book talks about, and the ending of 1984 has often been referred to as a symbol of Orwell's pessimism with regards to mankind's ability to break free from oppression. But that, in my opinion, is not necessarily the case. First of all, let's be clear about one thing. Everyone breaks under torture at some point. It doesn't matter who you are, you will have a limit, and whether it's someone cutting your fingers off or threatening to molest or kill your loved ones, you are going to break when that limit is reached. And if you consider the fact that Winston is exposed to his greatest fear, something that lies so deep in the mind that all ability to actively control your own emotions and behavior is most likely entirely washed away, something which anyone who has experienced an anxiety attack can ascribe to without blinking. And even if we consider a scenario where O'Brien had not broken Winston would have been killed and the rebellion would have been quashed anyway. The point is therefore that the fact that Winston breaks in the end is, in my opinion, not as relevant as the reasons for why he breaks. And the special detail that I've been referring to during the entire video, the detail that I want to talk about now, is something that occurs during one of the many conversations that O'Brien has with Winston during his captivity. Something which has to do with moral philosophy. But first, to understand the context of this, we briefly have to go back to earlier in the story. When Winston and Julia are originally recruited by O'Brien, whom they think is a resistance fighter at this point, O'Brien asks them about their willingness to commit various atrocities for the sake of the Brotherhood, this alleged resistance group that O'Brien represents. In other words, he claims to be testing how far the two are willing to go to fight Big Brother and the party. He asks them if they're prepared to lie, steal, cheat, murder, and even throw acid on a child's face to fight against the party. Now they both affirm their commitment to doing these things, emphasizing their dedication to the cause. However, this commitment is later weaponized against Winston. During his torture, he has several conversations with O'Brien, who seeks to gradually break his spirit. In one of these conversations, Winston argues against the party's cruelty and the horror of its actions. At this point, of course, his spirit is still intact. In response, O'Brien confronts Winston with his own willingness to commit terrible acts in the name of rebellion. O'Brien forces Winston to confront his own fallibility and the extent of his betrayal, not only to the party, but to his own sense of morality. The point being made in this case is that Winston is essentially no different from the party, because he's simply prepared to commit the same horrific acts as the party is willing to commit. And this is instrumental to breaking down Winston's spirit, because by demonstrating to Winston that his resistance fight is not morally superior to the actions of the party, he destroys Winston's self-identification with his own cause, as his accusations are turned into self-condemnation for Winston. And this confrontation is pivotal in breaking Winston's spirit and reshaping his beliefs and loyalty to align with the party's demands. Based on this, I invite you to consider what I said in the beginning of this video. Is it truly the intent of Orwell to portray Winston Smith as a positive character? And why do we sympathize with him? We sympathize with him because he's the underdog, because he's oppressed and he has an urge for freedom. He has the will and desire to fight his oppressors, and therefore we as readers are naturally on his side. The truth is, maybe we shouldn't be. I mean, like I said in the beginning of this video, of course we sympathize with the drive to break free from an oppressive regime. In other words, of course we should sympathize with Winston's goal. But ask yourself this, do Winston's goals in themselves make him a positive or morally sound character? As Winston is prepared to kill, steal and severely hurt innocent civilians, is he really that different from some of the revolutionaries who throughout history have sought to break down the oppressive regimes they lived under, but then, after succeeding, instated new oppressive regimes often worse than the original ones? People like Lenin and Stalin, who drove the Russian Revolution, might have had the goal, might even have believed in the goal of ending oppression and creating a utopia. But the means by which they tried to reach this utopia made their own society de facto almost worse than anything the world had ever seen before. And as Orwell is writing his book in the late 1940s, he's had a very good chance to observe what might happen on the other side of a violent revolution. So going back to Winston Smith, I am sorry to tell you, but he's not a positive character. Instead, Winston can be regarded as the equivalent of historical figures such as Lenin, Stalin or Mao, and the manifestation of the idea that the end justifies the means. Therefore, while the party, personified in Big Brother or more concretely in O'Brien as the story's antagonist, represents the oppressive regime that has arisen after a violent revolution, Winston Smith, our beloved protagonist, symbolizes the root of that same oppressive regime, the totalitarianism in its infant form before the revolution. In that sense, symbolically of course, Winston is Big Brother, because he is morally equivalent to the party and whoever drove its path to power. Of course, he's a human being driven by the dream of liberty. Remember that and sympathize with that dream. But one of the significant reasons why his spirit breaks is that he himself is as morally corrupt as the party. He believes his own cause to be righteous, but once O'Brien demonstrates that it isn't, Winston's identity begins to crumble, which opens up the door for the brainwashing which ultimately leads to the total breaking of his spirit. Remember that the rest of the torture is just a formality. Everybody breaks at some point. The thing is, 1984 is not a tale of a good character to whom a tragedy occurs despite him being a good character. Instead, 1984 is the story of totalitarianism. The idea that the end justifies the means, where the protagonist represents the unsuccessful attempt to acquire power, and the antagonist represents the regime that arises after a successful violent revolution. In other words, Big Brother is what Winston would have become if he had succeeded. And what Orwell seeks to teach us is that if we seek to fight oppressive power structures, if we identify ourselves with the goal of increasing liberty, equality, peace, etc., we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard with regards to the means we're prepared to use to reach these goals. This is furthermore the ingredient to maintaining a strong spirit, rightfully knowing that you are morally superior to the structures of injustice that you're fighting. Now, had Winston been unwilling to commit these atrocities, he would of course still have been broken. As I said before, and I'll say it again, everybody breaks at some point. But if we truly believe in these goals, and if we seek to establish an unbreakable spirit and longing for freedom, we need to make sure that however liberty-oriented, egalitarian or humanitarian our goals might be, we must not be prepared to compromise our values on the path to accomplishing these goals. And just as Winston, we will all break at some point. But by maintaining morality every step of the way, that very urge for freedom has a chance to become an immortal echo that sooner or later will attract other like-minded characters, prepared to fight oppression, but not prepared to sell their souls for an easy win. Thank you so much for watching this video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this. If you like these kinds of topics, remember to show the YouTube algorithm how important this conversation is. Remember to leave a comment after you watch this video if you have any opinion about this yourself. And otherwise, I'll see you out there.